$11.2 million.
That is a very specific and I'm guessing a very significant number to start us off with.
It is. And just to be clear, right out of the gate, that's not a lottery jackpot. It's not the budget for some new blockbuster.
Okay.
That is the amount of money the Alabama Department of Corrections, the ADOC, generated from their work release program. That's cash paid directly to the department.
Wow. And that's for what period?
That's the kicker. It's just the year-to-date figure as of August 2024.
That is a staggering figure.
Yeah.
And honestly, it sets the perfect stage for what we're doing today. Because usually when we look at prison systems, the conversation is all about, crime rates, sentencing guidelines.
Right, maybe rehabilitation if we're feeling optimistic.
Exactly. But today, we're stripping all of that away. We are putting on our green accountant visors.
We're performing an economic autopsy of the Alabama prison system.
That's it. The whole premise of this deep dive is that the ADOC isn't just a government agency. It is a complex, multi-billion-dollar business ecosystem.
And to get to the bottom of it, we've pulled a ton of documents. We've got ADOC monthly reports from 2021 to 2025, legislative contract reviews.
We also have RFPS requests for proposal for things like inmate communications and some very dense, very eye-opening reports on what researchers are calling the punishment economy.
And our mission is simple. We just want to unpack how the state actually generates revenue from the people inside these fences.
So we're going to look at labor.
We're looking at the fees families pay just to stay in touch.
And the massive private contracts that, keep the whole system turning.
And we have to look at those blurred lines. I mean, where does making money stop and rehabilitation begin?
And maybe most uncomfortably, we have to grapple with why so many of these sources keep bringing up the 13th Amendment and the concept of modern-day slavery.
So let's get into the ledger. The first thing that jumped out at me was just the idea of staying in touch. You think, I want to call my mom. You just pick up the phone.
Simple transaction.
But inside an Alabama prison, that phone call is a sophisticated revenue stream.
A very significant one. We need to talk about site commissions.
Site commissions.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds like, zoning paperwork or something you just skip over.
It sounds innocent, but reading the Political Economy of Inmate Telecommunications source, well, they describe them as legalized kickbacks.
Legalized kickbacks. Okay, explain that. Because normally, a company bids on a government contract by saying, I can do it cheaper or I can do it better.
Right. But here, the incentives are completely flipped. When a private telecom company wants to run the prison phone system, they aren't just competing on who has the best service.
No.
They're competing on how much of the money they're willing to kick back to the ADOC.
So walk me through that. If I'm a family member and I pay, say, $10 for phone time to talk to my brother.
A huge chunk of that doesn't even go to the phone company.
It goes where?
Straight into the prison's pocket. The documents show the ADOC gets a monthly revenue share from the phone system of between $300,000 and $350,000.
Wait, monthly?
Every single month. So you do the math, and that's somewhere between $3.6 and $4.2 million a year.
Just from phone calls?
Just from phone calls. And historically, in some parts of Alabama, these commissions have been as high as 80% of the total call revenue.
80%. That's, for every dollar a grandmother spends to talk to her grandson, 80 cents is basically a fee paid to the facility.
Exactly. And you have to think about who's paying it. It's not the inmate.
It's the family.
It's the family on the outside. And the sources, like the Phoning Home Report, they all point out these are often the most economically disadvantaged people in the state. It's a wealth transfer from poor families directly to the state budget.
And I saw in the fine print, it's not just the commission, is it? There's a specific tax, too.
Oh, yeah. The Alabama Utility Gross Receipts Tax. It's just layer upon layer of cost. But what I found really fascinating in the recent documents is the shift toward video visitation.
That sounds like a good thing, right? Like FaceTime for families who can't drive for hours to a prison.
In theory, yes. But the documents show a different motivation. Facilities often see it not as a supplement, but as a replacement.
A replacement for what?
For face-to-face visits, the free ones. If you get rid of the in-person visit, you basically force the family to use the paid video service if they want to see their loved one.
So you create a bottleneck on human connection, and then you charge a toll to open it.
That's one way to put it. And this creates what analysts call fiscal reliance. The state starts balancing its budget on these fees.
Which means?
It means if the ADOC suddenly decided to make all phone calls free, they would blow a multi-million-dollar hole in their own budget. They have a structural disincentive to be humane.
Wow. The system is basically addicted to the revenue, but that's just the phones. I want to circle back to that number from the top, the 11.2 million from work release.
This is probably the biggest direct financial asset the ADOC has.
So break down the program. This is inmates leaving the prison to go work for private companies.
That's right. They're bussed out to poultry plants, manufacturing sites, all sorts of places. And if you just look at the gross numbers, it seems okay. They're earning a salary.
How much?
In August 2024 alone, the gross salaries earned by inmates were about $26.4 million.
26 million in 1 month. So if you're listening, you might think, okay, that's a good way to get back on your feet. You're earning a wage.
It does sound like that until you look at the next column, the one labeled total deductions.
Uh-oh.
In that same month, the deductions taken from those paychecks came to about $4.8 million.
And what are they deducting? Is it just taxes, Social Security?
It's way beyond that. They are deducting money for room, board, and transportation.
So you're saying the inmate is paying rent to the prison for their own incarceration?
Essentially, yes. The state takes a huge cut of their paycheck to support other departmental needs.
That's efficient, I guess, from their perspective. The inmate earns a wage, and the prison says, thanks, we'll take our cut for the privilege of housing you.
Precisely. And the language they use in their own strategic plan is so revealing. They explicitly call the work release program a major financial asset.
They're not even hiding it.
Not at all. They see this labor pool as a revenue generator that's critical to their whole operation.
So follow that logic. If the program is a major financial asset, what does that do to the actual goal of prison?
It creates a massive conflict of interest. I mean, think about it. If you rely on that $11 million a year to keep the lights on.
Do you really want to reduce the prison population?
Exactly. If you successfully rehabilitate everyone and send them home, you lose your workforce. You lose your revenue stream.
You lose your asset.
The economic incentive is to keep the beds full and the buses running.
That is just structurally terrifying. Okay, but that's work outside the prison. What about the work inside? I was looking at the reports on Alabama Correctional Industries, or ACI.
Right, they make the license plates, furniture, all that stuff.
And you'd think, okay, captive workforce, no market wages, no unions. This has to be a massive cash cow, right?
You would absolutely think that. Low labor costs should equal high profits.
It's business 101.
But the reality in the documents is much stranger. In fiscal year 2024, ACI actually reported a net loss of about $789,000.
Wait, hold on. They have basically free labor,
Yeah.
and they lost almost $1 million. How is that even possible?
It really makes you question the management. It varies wildly. I mean, the clothing plants, the mattress plant, those made money.
Okay.
But the vehicle tag plant, the one making all our license plates, it lost over $713,000.
We are losing money-making license plates. That feels like the one thing a prison industry should have completely locked down.
It would appear not. And then you have the real anomaly, the chemical plant. Did you see that in the strategic plan?
The ghost plant. Yes, I did. I had to read that line twice.
So the plan notes the chemical plant lost over $191,000. But here's the kicker.
What?
The report says it employed 0 inmates.
So, it's an empty building that's losing $200,000 a year.
That's what it looks like. The report itself calls it a pure financial drain. It's this weird paradox. They're exploiting the labor, but they're so inefficient they're not even making a profit from it in some cases.
Let's talk about that labor cost, because when we say low pay, we're not talking minimum wage.
Not even close. Well, federal prisons might pay, 23 cents to $1.15 an hour. The punishment economy source is clear that in many state systems, including Alabama, prisoners often work for pennies. Or for nothing at all.
Nothing.
0. The source directly compares these state prison enterprises to a modern version of the convict leasing system. Which brings us to the heaviest part of this whole discussion. We have to talk about the 13th Amendment.
Right. And I think most people know the 13th Amendment as the one that abolished slavery. That's the headline.
It is, but there's an except. There's a loophole.
The clause.
Except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. That is the constitutional escape hatch.
So when critics call this slave labor, they aren't just using a metaphor, they're being literal.
From a constitutional standpoint, yes. The state has the legal right to compel labor without pay. And the punishment economy report made a really sharp point about this during the pandemic.
The essential workers thing.
Yeah. Think back to when everything shut down. But in Alabama, kitchen details, laundry workers, they were deemed essential. They had to keep working, often in crowded conditions, for no pay.
And it's not just making things for ACI, right? It's just the basic running of the prison, the cooking, the cleaning.
That's the internal maintenance. This is the invisible subsidy. If the ADOC had to pay minimum wage for the labor required just to feed and clean up after 20,000 inmates,
The whole financial system would collapse overnight.
it is completely subsidized by the unpaid labor of the people inside it. And this work is often framed as a privilege. If you refuse or you mess up, you lose the privilege. You get sent to worse conditions. It's forced compliance.
Okay, so we've covered how the state makes money or saves money from the inmates. But someone else is definitely making money here. This is a marketplace.
This is where we get into the private vendors, the billion-dollar ecosystem.
The healthcare contract was the one that made my jaw drop. $1 billion. I thought it was a typo.
No typo. The vendor YesCare, which used to be Corizon, has a contract valued at $1.06 billion over 4 years.
That is just a staggering amount of taxpayer money.
And the scrutiny.
Yeah.
Well, one source was scathing. They said a contract of this size was handled like a contract for $1.06.
Meaning no oversight.
Very little, with allegations of undue influence. And you have to remember, this is for health care, in a system the Department of Justice has sued for providing inadequate care. So $1 billion flows out, but is the service actually improving?
It's the recurring theme. Money flows out, conditions don't change. What about the buildings themselves? I read about the plan to build these mega prisons.
This has been a huge political saga. The plan was to use $400 million, some of it pandemic relief funds, to build 2 new supersized prisons.
Hang on, pandemic relief funds to build prisons.
Yes, a highly controversial move. And while the state is funding it now, the private prison, Giant CoreCivic, was deeply involved in the initial lease negotiations.
And the ACLU had a problem with that renting idea, didn't they?
They did. Their argument is that leasing just lines the pockets of private companies without fixing the root causes. You're not fixing the violence or the staffing. You're just paying rent on a newer, more expensive warehouse.
It's like putting a $400 million coat of paint on a crumbling house.
And you're paying rent to a landlord who profits from you staying there. The more beds they build, the more pressure there is to fill them.
There's one last little thing I want to hit, because we've talked about getting in and being there. What about when you get out? The debit cards.
Release cards. This is the final extraction.
Yeah. So you get out, you walk through the gate, they don't hand you cash.
Nope. Often any money you have left is put on a debit release card from a company like JPay.
And let me guess, fees?
Steep usage and maintenance fees. So you've got maybe $50 to your name to restart your life, and a private company takes a cut just for you to use your own money.
It's relentless. Every single step is monetized. The person is just a conduit for money to move from families and taxpayers to the state and these companies.
That's the ecosystem we talked about at the start.
So let's just try to summarize this cycle.
It is a cycle.
Yeah.
You have the state generating revenue from phone kickbacks and work release to balance its budget.
Then you have the private sector YesCare, CoreCivic, generating billions from healthcare and construction contracts.
And in the middle of it all,
The inmate, they're the raw material for both. They consume the high-priced services, and they provide the low-cost labor.
and while all this money is moving around, the reality inside the walls is chaos. The system is at nearly 200% capacity,
The homicide rate.
6 times the national average.
6 times.
So you have a system that is incredibly dangerous and failing at its basic mission, yet it's a reliable financial engine for the state and for private contractors.
It really makes you question the goal. If the system was actually working, if it was rehabilitating people, the population would go down, the revenue would go down.
Exactly. And that brings us to that last uncomfortable question from their own strategic plan.
What's that?
If the Department of Corrections relies on the $11 million from work release and the millions from phone kickbacks just to balance its books,
Yeah.
does it actually have a financial incentive to reduce the prison population? Or does its business model depend on keeping those beds filled?
That is a haunting question, and it's one you only get by looking at the bank account.
You have to follow the money.
Well, that is certainly enough to make you think differently about the cost of justice. Thanks for listening to this deep dive.
Take care.